Justin, how are you, sir?
Doing great, thanks.
Fantastic.
Thanks for having me today.
You work for the Idaho Coalition of Land Trusts. This is something that is very, very important to me as I've been educated on how it relates to our communities, to the spread of not just aesthetically like, oh, I like seeing the Highland cows like in the pasture over there, but very functionally what happens in the state of Idaho. And that's, again, so you work for that coalition. It's a member paying organization, and you guys work with people that are interested in doing land trust, interested in understanding about funding, and essentially just assessing what the benefits could be for them.
Sure. There's a national organization, the Land Trust Alliance, and that tends to be where most land trusts seek accreditation or sort of the national standards. So in Idaho, we bring it closer to home. So really, we are the gathering place for all of our dues-paying members. So we have in Idaho, we have 9 regional land trusts. So they have a 5-10 county region, depending on where it is. And that's who we do most of our work with. And so I specifically focus on agricultural easements. So, conservation easements, I know you've talked to a lot of people about conservation easements, so you generally know what they are. I tend to focus more on agricultural easements, so I am learning more and more about conservation easements and how else they can be used. But once again, conservation of agricultural lands is where I spend most of my days. And I'm the agricultural easement coordinator. Would be my title. So that's, would be on my business card or my email signature. So ultimately what I do is if you are a land trust and you have a landowner that's come to you and said, I'm interested in putting a conservation easement on my farm, on my ranch, on my property, specifically to keep this land in agricultural production sure. In perpetuity or forever. Often the word for conservation easements is perpetuity. So there's other tools out there that function more like a lease. So they have a term, 10 years, 20 years, 30 years,
right.
There's all sorts of things. But ultimately, this is in perpetuity. So someone asked me once, what does that mean? Well, I think it's an idea or an ideal. As long as things go like they're going and the laws are what they are, then this land will be protected in perpetuity. So I don't know about you, but my brain can't really imagine 200 years in the future or 100 years or maybe even 50.
And they're like, our great granddad, Justin, put this into, and so and he's still there, man.
For sure. Right. So, we're talking about perpetuity. We're making the assumption that this is what's happening. Like we're putting this stake in the ground and saying this is going to stay in production.
Gotcha. And when you're saying conservation easements and agriculture easements, conservation easement is when somebody owns a piece of land and they're like, I would like to conserve this land in some particular way. They engage a land trust that holds the easement, right? And that's essentially saying that, okay, the land will be used in this function or we're removing this functionality from the land. And when you're saying agricultural, you're saying it's a conservation easement that is intending to preserve the agricultural production and functionality of the land. That's the goal of it.
Precisely. And really...
so it's just a layer, it's like a subset of a conservation easement is an agricultural. So right. Presumably you could give up, for instance, rights to, let's say, mining or mineral production or things. So we can break off all of these rights that property owners have and put any of them in, or not any of them, but there are standard ones that we could yank out and put into a land trust in order to conserve it in a certain way. Agriculture is one of them.
Right.
Got it.
So it really is something to think about, maybe to go up a little bit into the umbrella term of what a conservation easement is. So in general, that's in Idaho, it's identified by statute. So a conservation easement is a non-possessory interest. Gotcha. So that, in short, means if I do a conservation easement on my land, I still hold title to my land. I'm not giving the title away. What's actually relinquished is a right. So in this case, in an agricultural easement, there's really 2 things that happen. The first thing is it says, I'm not going to develop it. Or if it is developed, it's going to be put in very specific areas, but generally it's not going to be sold and turned into a subdivision or even say like a subdivision like we think of, right?
Sure.
Like, cul-de-sacs and all of that.
Sure,
There's also more rural subdivisions, right? Where it's like 5-acre parcels. That's a pretty popular one in other parts of the state. I mean, it happens here in the Treasure Valley too, but in other parts of the state, that's a pretty common use of the land.
It's still development. If you had a 1,000-acre farm, whatever it is, if you break it up into 20 or 205-acre plots or something, that you're still developing it. You're changing the highest and best use of it, and you're changing it forever if you start developing.
So exactly. And so something to think about when you're talking about development, right? Development in the Treasure Valley, for example, where we are, is maybe you had a cornfield, and then you see the sign go up that says it's the county saying it's going to be rezoned. Well, that's already been sold by the farmer, likely to an investor who's then been approached by maybe a major home builder, and they're going to build however many 100 homes on that land.
Sure.
So we watch it go from a cornfield right away to multiple homes being built, and a neighborhood is there within, however long.
3 years, boom.
Right. So in other parts of the state that are more rural, that doesn't happen that way. Landowners need a little cash. They'll sell 10 acres here, 20 acres there, 100 acres there. They got 1,000. They have a few to sell. So what a conservation easement does in that, or an agricultural easement in this case, what happens there is it stitches the parcels together. So for example, if you have 5 parcels and you got 1,000 acres and it's across 5 parcels, you put an agricultural easement that says this land is going to stay together, first of all. So it becomes, instead of 5 parcels, it becomes one. It's looked at as one because you get a survey and you have a legal description, and that goes into your conservation deed, which we can get to in just a moment what that is. But that says that these 5 parcels are going to stay together. You can't sell off the 20 here or the 40 there. So really what's happening is it looks differently depending on where you are. It's very obvious if you're in a high growth county like Ada or Canyon, what that looks like. If you're in a slower growth county, or it's not developing the same way, say like Kootenai County, they have a lot of development happening. They do have a lot of home building, but they also have a lot of 5-acre parcels being used. So high development zones just looked at a different way.
Sure. And so what would happen then is, instead of saying, okay, I have 5 200-acre parcels, I now have one collectively, essentially legally binding 1,000-acre parcel. And this 1,000-acre parcel has this collection of rights, and I'm going to remove presumably one of them, which is the right to develop this as whatever. Now, in a high growth county, that would be really relevant, obviously, because you're like, okay, well, we have enough developers that could actually absorb this 1,000 acres all in one chunk. In slower growth counties, that's less likely, as you're pointing out, like Kootenai County. Maybe you don't have people that want to take 1,000 acres. They're like, look, I really just need 200 acres. I just need 100 or whatever it is. So just by the fact that you're stitching them together could become a prohibitive mechanism to stop people from developing. But then you can also remove that right to develop from that as well.
Right.
Gotcha.
Yeah, certainly. And so, really, there's been some conversation about like agricultural easements, right? You asked what that is. So ultimately, I've even heard it say it's the least restrictive easement. When you're thinking about conservation easements, the umbrella, an agricultural easement is one of the least restrictive. So what it's saying, really, the only, maybe you've heard the bundle of sticks analogy. So like when you have a piece of property, there's a bundle of sticks.
No, but it makes perfect sense.
Right. So I wish I could be really great at telling this analogy, but really with an agricultural easement, you're taking away the ability to chop it up and sell it. So that's one stick you're going to take away. So what's left is you still get to run cattle, you still get to use your tractors, you still get to change your crops, like
you have
all the
water
things.
rights, you have mineral rights, you have rights perhaps directly up in the air, like
correct.
Right.
So mineral rights. So it's interesting you bring up mineral rights. So right now in Idaho, maybe a little background would be helpful. So right now in Idaho, pretty much the biggest program you're going to use if you're a land trust and you're looking to help a farmer put a conservation easement, or a producer rather, put a conservation easement or an agricultural easement in this case on their property. Likely you're going to go use the NRCS, Natural Resources Conservation Service. So that's a part of the United States Department of Agriculture, or USDA. So they have a program that will has money available to put an agricultural easement, that they'll pay for a portion of it. Often it's 50%. For the very best of the best, it's 75%. So that's like the most beautiful grassland, not a lot of invasive species, really rewarding people for responsible grazing. And, I don't really know exactly what that looks like. As far as like, I'm not a range guy, but I know, like, we know what beautiful land looks like.
Sure.
We can look at something, and if it just brings that, like, wow, this is beautiful. There's cows grazing, there's deer in the field, there's elk, like that kind of stuff.
I went to I drove my son to my 10-year-old. He wanted to go catch lizards, right? So I get a hold of this guy, Charlie Justice from the Retired Fish and Game. I'm like, Charlie, you're a reptile guy. He apparently did this giant bust on the snake king of the Treasure Valley. So there's this guy living in an apartment who was like running this illegal snake operation, and they would go out to the desert, they would grab native species, just like harvest essentially from our desert areas, and then ship them off to like Arizona or Florida, whoever wants crazy snakes and stuff. Anyway, so he does this bust. So he's this big reptile guy. I was like, Charlie, where are the reptiles? He's like, all right, you got to go to Murphy, go to Rabbit Creek Road, third cattle guard on the park on the left, trails on the right. And so literally I have to look up Murphy and, look up Rabbit Creek Road. I'm like, it's an hour away. So, 6 a.m. because it's summertime, I grab my 10-year-old. I'm like, come on, bud, we're going. So we're in the car and we're like, oh my God, what are we doing? I'm like drinking my coffee. He's like rubbing it in his eyes. But half hour in, we're totally out of, developed area. We're driving, south, obviously. It was the most gorgeous. I started taking pictures like crazy. Like, this is wild. I mean, the sun's coming up. It's like 7 a.m. You see these beautiful, mesas and, this farmland. I was like, it was gorgeous. Like, this is wild. And then, of course, we did find lizards. They were not messing around, though. These were the fastest lizards I've ever seen in my life. Like, they were not like lazy bluebellies from California. Like, these guys were hauling. We didn't catch a single one, but we did find some scorpions and a snake. So that was cool. Right. Anyway, yeah. So beautiful. Like, when you see it, you're like, that's something different.
Right. Yeah. So, there's definitely options. So then, when you think about, okay, well, where is the other 50% coming from? We'll just work with 50. That's the most common.
Sure.
Scenario.
And what you're saying is you get from the federal government, it's very common in an agricultural easement, whatever the value of that easement is as determined by a specialty appraiser, whatever that value is, let's say it's $100,000. It's very common to get the 50% of that. So $50,000 from the federal government. But then you have this delta of the other 50 where you're like, okay, wait, but if I take this stick out of my bundle that allows me to break this up and develop it, you're saying it's worth $100,000, but I'm only getting 50,000 of those dollars. What about the other 50, bro?
Right, for sure. And I think it's important to say, like, the way that those specialty appraisals are done. So, for example, they appraise your property, and let's say the whole property is worth $1 million. And then they do comps, just like you would in a residential appraisal. That part is similar. They look for comparables, hopefully in the area, maybe out of the state. So that what they're looking at is what happened to this property. What would happen if you took away the right to basically split it up and develep it?
Right. How much is it worth now? How much if you took it away? Blah, blah, blah.
And so, the official word for that is diminution of value. And I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. Diminution of value. So
sounds great.
It's a percentage, right?
Great.
It's a percentage of these bundle of rights are worth X dollars.
Sure.
So that's done by this, by the appraisal. So it usually is a diminution of value. It's given a percentage. So for example, let's say it was 40%. That's maybe right in the middle. It could be sometimes as high as 50, as low as 30. Because something to keep in mind is when an appraiser looks at something, in a residential house, they're looking at the comparables. So they're looking at maybe your square footage, the lot, the views, kind of how a lot of things sort of get taken into account. Well, this kind of appraisal is the same thing. A conservation easement appraisal is the same thing, except what they're taking into consideration is how many you can hold back some for development, meaning if you wanted to build maybe 1 or 2 more homes for your family, or you wanted to build housing for, let's say you had workers and you want to build more housing on your property, you can create building envelopes in the easement and say, here is where development's going to happen, or building. I shouldn't say development because it's not like you're going to build a neighborhood, but you might build barracks style housing.
You need like the tiny village glamping with like the mini houses and get agritourism and just have 10 mini houses in a circle around a central fire pit area where like people do family reunions and then they can go like walk the fields and feel like earthy. That is a business model, my guy. If we could get something, I'm telling you, right, we would make money. Like the mini house vacation setup is the business.
Right. We got
it.
wine country, right?
We got
You know,
wine
putting a
country.
plug in for wine country.
Dude,
Definitely.
that's what like 3 Horse Vineyard, they should do a tiny village and they should do like a wedding venue where everyone stays there. You get to like take the pictures in the vineyard. I'm sure they already have this.
Well, I
But
think Sawtooth did. They had glamping tents. Was it 2 summers ago?
hell yeah. Everybody got bed bugs,
wall
but it's
tent.
okay.
I mean,
like,
it was beautiful while it lasted, right?
beautiful.
Until the next day when you're scratching all day long.
Oh my God. Like that the whole glamping thing, I find it so interesting because people are like, oh my God, it's like you're inside, but you're outside. It's like, yeah. And the bugs are inside and outside. Like you're not actually this is not the way to run an Airbnb, bro. I can't wait till people just get done with the fascination of Airbnb. Like everybody turning in Berkeley. Okay. So I'm living there. This is like a decade and a half ago. My buddy Mark is like, have you seen some of the Airbnbs lately? He's this old school Berkeley landlord. I'm like, no, Mark, I haven't seen the Airbnbs lately. He's like, some of them are getting ridiculous. I'm like, I mean, like a 1-bedroom instead of 2-bedroom. He's like, no. And he pulls up this literal ad, and it was $100 a night on a tent on someone's deck, but you got to use the kitchen and the bathroom, just the bathroom and the common space though, not that. And it was like, he was like, people are paying for this over like football game days. So they like go to the football game and then just get hammered and like go stay in a tent on someone's deck. I was like, God bless America, man. Bring your own sleeping bag. So bad. People are so, anyway, back to this. So yeah, so you can break off a building envelope and have, you know, like a small portion that, you know, you're either going to use for yourself for functionality or whatever.
Right. So the more restrictive, meaning the less you hold back as far as like places to build, the more of a loss you're taking on your land. Loss meaning the value. So your diminution, if you maintain more building envelopes or the ability to build more, then that means the less
reimbursement you get because you're giving up less.
Right. I mean, it seems pretty obvious in a sense.
If I have 1,000 acres and I'm like, hey, I want to do an easement, but only for 100 acres. They're like, great. Then I'm going to give you 100 acres worth of value.
Yeah.
They're like, but it's worth like, well, I have 1,000 acres. Like, yeah, bro, but like, we all know what you're doing.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, gotcha. And you know, there are plenty of bad actors out there. You can Google, do all the Googling you want and Google conservation easements. And likely you're not going to find success stories of small businesses that are successful or families that made the choice and are really happy. A lot of the negative press about conservation easements as a tool generally come from bad actors, shall we say. Yeah. And these are not the people that we're working with at the Coalition of Land Trusts. Our land trusts are working with families, small businesses, people that are wanting to preserve their way of life, wanting to preserve agriculture, wanting to preserve open space. This is not necessarily someone who is looking to sort of really cheat the American taxpayer. I mean, this is taxpayer money. It's federal agency funding. Right. So, you know, just like a mortgage company is going to ask you to meet some due diligence in order to have a mortgage funded, it's very similar with the federal government. I think something to keep in mind is there's some concern out there that if the federal government is involved, then automatically that means that your land can be taken. Well, the good news, I think, is that if you do a conservation easement or in an agricultural easement using federal agency funding, the landowner still holds title. Like you never, ever release your title. You work with a land trust. There's a certain minimum deed terms is what they're called. So the mechanism, what actually happens with an agricultural easement is a deed is drafted. And it says, you may do these things, you may not do these things. And of course, it's you know, tens of pages long. Sure. It's a lot of legalese. It's a contract. Ultimately, it says that you're not going to chop it up and build houses on it, or, you know, put a mine there. What happens when you as a landowner go to a land trust and say, I want to make sure no development ever happens. Sure. You know, you have a lot of conversations, you talk about expectations, and then ultimately, in the end, you go to a title company and you submit the conservation deed, if you will. Right. And then that is recorded with the county. And usually, well, you get compensated either way. You know, you've agreed to take one of the bundle of sticks out of your property. Yeah. You're going to get compensated for it. So there's two ways. Of course, you can get a payment, or you can And usually there's something called a bargain sale. And that is, we'll get into that in just a moment, because that comes all the way back to the appraisal. But before we go there, we'll put a pin in that and come back to it.
So you show up to title with the deed that's like
Right.
10, 20 pages long, and there's there's likely an escrow set up because obviously the deed has to be ratified by both parties, and this money, the 50% money, let's say, comes in from the federal government. The federal government is not letting a penny of that go before they know that this is all squarely done, notarized, every I is dotted.
Exactly.
So you got to take it to title, and then it becomes essentially recorded with that property. Well, excuse me, it goes out of title, gets recorded with the county.
Correct.
You get your payment, escrow functions appropriately, they disperse everything, everybody gets copies of everything, and we move from there.
Exactly. Right. So that's how, if I'm looking to purchase a piece of property and I have a pull title on it, that's going to show up. And that document will be recorded with title. And let's say a county is going to decides they want to do some development. Right. Or like, there's like the county too, or anybody who's going to see if they can make changes to this property. Yeah. There is the conservation deed on the title. So then then the next question is, well, how does this deed, how is it enforced, if you will? So there's been a payment. In this case, we're talking about the federal government's been involved.
Sure.
You've made an agreement as a landowner. A landowner has made an agreement, whether that they are still in possession of the land or the title to the land, or if it's been sold. There was still an agreement, and it carries with title. So it's transferable, it's insurable, it's all the things that you need to guarantee that it stays on the title.
Right.
So it doesn't just fall off when the next person buys it. It stays on the title.
But regardless of what's on the title, you still need an enforcement mechanism. Like, for instance, Senator Wintrow, I had her in for an awesome conversation a few months back, and she was saying that, look, we still have vestiges of like real racism here. And I'm like, what do you mean? Because like I didn't get it. And she's like, well, a couple of years ago, I worked on a bill to remove language on deeds. She said she had a constituent come forward and say, hey, I just bought this house and it says in the deed that only white people can live here. And that's kind of a thing for me. And he was like, do I even get to live here? I just bought this house. And she was like, oh my gosh. Now that may exist on the deed, but it's impossible to enforce, right? So the argument that a lot of people say is like, well, you can't enforce that. Like, yeah, it's on there, but it's meaningless because again, it's unenforceable. And again, that should be removed 100%, no questions there. But that's one of the ways of essentially changing laws is changing enforcement mechanisms. So in this case, if you have this money that's come out from the federal government and you have this deed, it's been ratified, it's been recorded, all these things, in the absence of somebody making sure it stays that way, then you essentially scam the whole system. Like there has to be something in place. So the federal government's like, hey, I gave you this, let's say $500,000. How do I know you're even going to make sure that what I want for this $500,000 is going to come to pass? And that's where the enforcement comes in.
Right. And that's, if you're talking with land trusts, you'll hear monitoring or stewardship.
Right.
So when you, as the landowner, put this deed on your property and it goes on the title, once again, you're still holding title. Sure. There is a third party now enforcement mechanism, if you will. And that sounds very aggressive. It's much more like, a person comes out and they walk around your property with you and they have, they make sure that the agreement that, if you're the landowner that's done it, that's done this conservation easement, or in this case, agricultural easement, they have to do monitoring. So they go out and they meet you once a year and you walk around the property and, if it's a farm, depending on, you probably go in the summer, so you see things growing, and that's really what happens. And so you go through, and a land trust will go out and look around and make sure that you're in compliance, if you will.
And they have to do this every year forever.
Forever. Yeah, exactly. Forever. Wow. In perpetuity. So that comes at a cost. So often there's a stewardship fund. Well, actually, all land trusts that are accredited have a stewardship fund. And hopefully all land trusts have a stewardship fund.
Sure. But accredited, it's just a requirement for sure.
Right. It's a requirement. So that says that you have the finances and you have the mechanisms in place in your business as an organization to maintain what you have.
Right. So the federal government knows when they give you the $500,000, you're not only going to, do everything correctly initially, but you will forever make sure that it maintains that.
Right. And, I guess one sticking point for many people is they see that the federal government has a third-party right of enforcement. So what that means is that the land trust is not performing, the federal government can step in, can make sure that the agreement is being followed, and can assign somebody else to take over. So like maybe another land trust comes in and says, we'll assume the stewardship for this.
The management of it.
Right. So there is on the deed, it does say the federal government. So, people often see that and they feel concerned about what that means. Well, that means that the federal government is going to make sure that the land trust is doing what they said they're going to do.
Right. A question for you. Can you, say I buy a piece of land. Let's say I buy a piece of land that has engaged in a land trust, agricultural easement, can't develop it, but I want to grow bison. I want to grow corn. I want to grow sugar beets. I want to get in sugar beets. I'm dying to. All right. So I buy this land and I get it at a discount compared to land that hasn't engaged in an easement because it's theoretically lacking one of the sticks that was worth something at some point. Somebody got paid for that. So instead of paying $2 million for this property, I'm paying $1 million. And again, just made up numbers. If I want to, is there any world where once somebody has engaged in a standard land trust where I, now the property owner, I'm like, oh, dude, I want that stick back so bad. And I don't want it back right now, but I want it back now because I think this is the path of progress. And in 20 years, boy, this is going to be prime development. Can somebody ever purchase back, pay back the federal government, take back that agricultural easement, remove that stick from the land trust and be like, I am whole once again?
Before I answer that, I want to address the discount piece.
Okay.
So when you say discount, I think what you're actually meaning is you're paying the agricultural value of the land.
Yes. And
not speculation value.
Yes. It's not discount. Okay. The discount I was talking about is you could take a identical property, one that has the capacity, has all the sticks in the bundle. You have all the capacity to develop, do whatever you want with it, and then take that identical piece with that one development stick removed.
Correct.
And that the development stick removed would appear to be at a discount compared to the other one that's whole.
Right.
You got 75%, 50%, whatever value that little stick had, and obviously depends on a number of things, as you're pointing out. But there's a diminished value.
Certainly. And that's the whole mechanism of the easement itself. And the reason I'm making that distinction is because some people think, well, I'm losing this value. Well, really, you're losing the speculative value.
Right.
Which is market dependent. I mean, all land's market dependent.
Sure.
But it does take out this, this maybe exponential amount that you think it might be worth in 10 years or 20 years. So to answer your actual question, so I was mentioning earlier about where does the other 50% come from? So let's say the agency funds 50% of the value of the easement. Well, there's another 50% out there. So you can do that as a donation to a land trust since it's a 501c3 nonprofit. You can take that as a tax donation. So, I don't know exactly what's involved in that as far as how that would look for each operation. That would definitely be something someone would want to work through with their tax, whoever
CPA,
works with them does their taxes. Right. So what happens is once you take that tax donation, which most people do at least find some, as far as I know, most transactions do have the tax donation contribution. And they do find a way to take some of it. Now, I don't know that you can take all of it. A lot of times farmers or ranchers will say, I have all the deductions I need. I don't need another tax deduction. Right. That's the last thing I need. Well, often there is some place to use it. Maybe you have a great year. You have a number of years to use this sort of donation component. So once you've taken finance, you've been compensated from the agency. You've also taken a tax deduction. I don't know how you would go back and say, I really don't really want this. And, it's a legally binding contract. Right. So, as far as I know, there have definitely been people that have bought property and said, I don't want this anymore, and I'm going to sue and I'm going to get it off. Well, to my knowledge, that's never been able to happen. No one so far has been successful in doing that.
So it's like in practice, there's nobody that functionally has done this. There are people that have intended to do it. There have been people that have tried to do it, and nobody has actually managed to do it.
Right.
Wow. Okay. So that's good to know, right?
So,
This is not like a, hey, we want this money, we want this benefit until we don't want it anymore. It's like, no. This is it. And there's no sly like, hey, I'm a Texas billionaire, I'm going to grab up all this property at a discount that's in a land trust, and it's going to be cheaper, and then I'm going to sue, or I'm going to, pay back this money because it's worth so much more now. It's like, no. This is staying, like this is really actually protected.
Right.
That's great. That's great. It's great specifically because, like, I have a friend. I was telling you right before we started. I have a friend, Max. He's great. He's got an MBA, really smart, really capable, and has found himself in a position where he's like, listen, I don't have a bad life, but I would prefer more of a life in a rural area. He really enjoys daily labor and work. And like, I would love to have, like a gentleman's farm, or even a small, cattle or bison operation, whatever it might be. He's coming out with this butter stick tallow too. So he's this great idea. It's like, tallow in general is a really, really great fat to cook with, but it doesn't fit in people's workflow. So it's like, the problem is tallow always comes in jars. And what most people are used to is a butter knife and a stick of butter, cut it, put it in. It's like, whatever. And he's like, but like a jar and a spoon just doesn't work with people. So he's making butter stick shaped tallow and selling it as like, little, like, wrappings just right with a little piece of twine and a note on top, the whole artisan, whole artisan bit. But this is his vision, that he's like, I would love to move out to Idaho, have a stick operation, a tallow stick operation, and have cattle and like all these other things. And he's not a wealthy guy. So if there were like 100 acres that he could pick up that was specific to, farming, that had removed that easement, that would be really beneficial to him. And I imagine that that's a system in place that not just for my friend Max, who doesn't actually farm, but would like to do it, but other people are like, look, I am currently a farmer. I have 1,000 acres. I'd love 1,100 acres or 1,200 acres. And I don't need it for this other development purpose. I genuinely want to just purchase it for function. I don't care about that stick you took out. Like, great, let's get more of that. You got better operations. You have bigger operations. You have better offerings. That's all great. And knowing that it's going to stay that way, and you can build on top of it, right? Like, we stack every single year. We're stacking agricultural easements to conserve not just a way of life, but also the benefits to the rest of the community that we get, lest we forget that agricultural land is a net benefit to our, for instance, taxation and emergency services compared to, a single family house like my house. And I think Dave Anderson was telling me that the value for every dollar that's taken in, agricultural area only requires like 45 cents. So for every dollar they get taxed, they only need like 45 cents worth of emergency services, fire, EMS, whatever it might be. But for every dollar that's taken in from single family residences or just development area, it costs the county something like $1.40 in emergency services or, other things, because you're not producing anything. You're not doing anything that's worthy of taxation aside from just owning a home, right? And there are other, taxing districts, but that relationship where we have this net tax benefit to us that supports the rest of the community, if that goes away, we are all in trouble from a financial standpoint. That's when your property tax starts jacking up. That's when, costs of emergency services starts going up. Like, this is a real problem if we continue to lose agricultural land.
Right. Well, and I think what you're pointing at there is this big system, right? You're talking about like taxation. Let's even leave it at a county.
Sure.
So in a county, there might only be, I don't know, in Idaho, maybe 2 conservation easements, maybe 3, or agricultural easements specifically. So you're talking about like a big system, whereas this is an individual family by family basis. So I think what's interesting about the logic around what you're talking about is we know the data's there. It's been proven. It's been proven in Idaho. It's been proven really across the country. So we know that that's the case. Time and time again, the numbers say the same thing, that the agricultural land does subsidize or really feeds the city. in a lot of ways, right? Metaphorically and literally, feeds the city. Well, then we kind of come back to the land trust and the agricultural easement, and it's, one person that says, I don't want this to turn into development. And so they're not necessarily thinking about, well, I really want to keep this in agriculture because I want to make sure our tax base is solvent in the county. Like, that's not the decision they're making.
Of course,
right? And so, like, there's all these decisions that get made. Like your friend you were mentioning wants to come out to Idaho and would really appreciate having land that was available for purchase that he gets to purchase for only the agricultural value, much like the discount you were talking about.
Yes.
Like, he gets to come and pay what the land is worth for what he wants to do with it. And I think that's one aspect, right? We think of this, your friend, right? He wants to build a business and he wants to do these things. And probably it sounds like a really cool thing. It's going to likely continue to grow. He's going to want to he's going to move to Idaho. We'll play this scenario. He's going to move to Idaho and he's going to come out here and he's going to buy 100 acres. And let's say he somehow finds a land that has an easement or conservation deed on it that's recorded with title. He pays the agricultural value of the property. That's definitely a downstream, like that's more downstream and in the future and sort of the best case scenario of what would happen. Well, then he wants to expand and he keeps expanding and his business is growing and he's really living his best life. He gets the best of both. He gets to use his MBA and grow his business. He gets to put his hands in the dirt or whatever he wants to do with it.
Stick tallow all day.
Right. I probably
shouldn't have said his secret. Like, he's very into this. It's like, nobody take this idea.
Yeah. It's already been copyrighted probably. So don't even try.
He has tags on the sticks. You can't.
Right. So we
did you know that there's a difference in fat throughout the animal? Like, there's this collection of fat on top of the kidneys that's like the choice fat. It's melting temp is better, like it's consistent. And then there's like this general fat in other places. So like if you were in an agricultural area like this that obviously has large cattle operations, he could get real specific with sourcing like the specialty fat. This could be the hotbed for like stick tallow.
Well, and why not?
Why not?
Why not?
Why not? Get out here, man.
Why not be the artisan food, a hotbed for artisan food, or just all food?
All food.
Why not? Why not? We need all of it.
And your point that you were making earlier, which is this is a very individualized decision, right? Like, the family is going to make the decision. The farming family is going to make the right decision for them. I agree. But what I think is left out of this conversation in general is the dum-dums like me who don't realize that the more we get farmers, the more we can incentivize from, not get farmers. I'm not trying to push anyone or manipulate them, but the more we can incentivize collectively as communities, our farmers to not just maintain operation of their farms, but also consider engagement with proper incentivization into agricultural easements, that only prolongs our lower tax base and our benefits. Like, that is really important. And again, this is when I first started talking I spoke with Senator Nichols just very briefly about this, probably like a year ago. Then I had Tammy Holcomb on from FARE Idaho, which was awesome. And she was talking about this. And the whole time it's like, why? I was thinking about this as kind of like a payout to a farm family. It's like, all right, you got, cashed out. You still get to, work your land. You still get to engage in your life, and you get a little bump of money. You can use it for capital improvements or whatever. Like, it doesn't really matter. Like, I get it. And that seems all well and fine, but it didn't have anything to do with me, the individual just living in a community. But in reality, it is very tied to me. It's very tied to the future of our community. It's very tied to the future affordability of our area. It's tied to the future food security that we enjoy today. But again, in the future, like, this is really we are all in this together. And I think it is really important for us to collectively as a community think like, okay, is there anything else we could do to incentivize farmers to stay in operation and some of them at least hopefully to engage in agricultural easements, something that makes sense to them, something that would make me, were I a farmer, say like, okay, that sounds like a good deal. Not guilt, not, beating them over the head. It's like, don't you want, it's like, no. Show me the money. Like, this is Jerry Maguire. Like, this person's engaged in business, and yeah, maybe they feel good about maintaining a way of life, but they need to be compensated appropriately so that they enter this voluntarily and happily.
Right. And really, for a lot of farm families, it's getting they don't make only a financial decision.
Right.
That's not necessarily the top line decision making that they go through. They're thinking about the future. They're thinking about the future of their community, maybe their family. If they're lucky, they have one of their kids who wants to come and take it over. And it is going to work their way up, and they're going to take over and follow in the footsteps of the generations before. There's other families that all their children, if they, let's say they don't have children, what are they going to do? Or if they have children that live somewhere else and do other things,
They're not
coming.
Not interested. Yeah.
Right. So then, there's this belief of, well, what am I going to do next? And if you're inheriting the business, let's say, because most farmers create the way that the land is often tied up in an LLC or it's tied up in a trust or something like that. It's not necessarily, it's a business basically. So you're while it is your family's ranch, it is a business at the end of the day. Like
Yes.
you do
Yes.
have inputs, you have outputs. You're looking at, your profit and loss, all the things. Like your friend that's an MBA, perfect for him. Like
Right.
you need a lot of business people in farming too. So what do you do with that? And I think a lot of times you think about, one of the groups of people that want to be on the land and find it quite unaffordable. It's conservation or agriculture easements can help that, because it does take that sort of real estate speculation out of that. It just takes it off the table. So you're only ever paying the agricultural value of the land. So what does that mean going forward? So we look at that and we say, okay, that's great. Now the land is the agricultural value. Well, like we were talking about, you can expand into other businesses, you can expand your land, but if there's a subdivision, you hit a wall and you're done expanding. So then what happens? You have to, let's say you have animals and you're trying to move them around in a pasture. It's a lot easier to move them pasture to pasture to pasture, maybe across a county road, than having to put them in a trailer.
Right.
Because then now you have, you have to leapfrog maybe over a subdivision or over development. And so now you're adding cost onto your operation.
Right.
And so that's only going to be passed on to the consumer.
Right.
So
plus and obviously it's a burden on the community around that, right? Like if you're just going pasture to pasture, that's fine. But like then if you have trailers going all over the place, like I had a former rep, Melissa Durant, who's talking about her family's engaged in agriculture in the Kuna area, and she's like, listen, you have people that are literally like, it's literally just farming between houses now, right? And they're trying to, farmers are trying to get their tractors down the road. People are, more people coming down these old kind of farm and county roads, honking at the farm. Like everybody's getting worked up. And it's like, well, I don't know what to tell you. You're breaking up these large agricultural areas with small developments. So it's like, it's no longer, 3 lots or 3 parcels all together. It's like a parcel, houses, parcel. So then like we got to go around it. It's more difficult, right? It just makes everything more difficult, more costly, more time consuming.
Right. And if we looked at what we're talking about here as a zero sum,
Right.
like there's an amount of resources that have to go into producing food. And in our case, well, in every case, it's water and it's soil and it's land and it's space and it's the people, the people doing it, right? We can mechanize it. We can do all sorts of different things, but ultimately you have to have space, and you have to have space in proximity to other space to keep this happening. And then when urban development gets sort of put in the mix, like you were saying about, talking about taxation and how all that fits in. I mean, if we're looking at this as like resources or sort of getting outside of using the word even taxes, if we have to have a certain amount of resources to produce food, we as, I live in a city, you live in a city, generally, we live in an urban area.
Yeah, right.
Urban in the sense of we don't live in a rural, we're not on acreage.
Right. Like I have small garden beds. I don't
Right.
live in an area where I could even produce any reasonable portion of my food.
Right. So if we look at that, I mean, we don't really, how do we consider that, right? When you were talking about like, how do we as a community come together and say, how are we going to incentivize working to protect farmland? We have the taxation aspect. We have what you were talking about, having sort of conflict of use, almost like farming between houses. And then you have big equipment on the roads with passenger vehicles and young drivers, or maybe even drivers that are not used to working or driving around equipment. So now you have a safety issue. And now you have maybe a subdivision out in an area that, services now have to be expanded to. So, these all have a cost. They all have a price tag, and we all ultimately pay it as a consumer. So, I mean, how do we evaluate that, and how do we look at from a perspective of how do we keep people on the land, or how do we at least keep the land available for people to come to it? Because once again, like you said earlier, no land trust, no organization is wanting to force a farmer to stay on their land. Like that is very much against what we are about as Americans. Is not how our legal system's set up. So,
well, in Idaho anyway,
right?
Other places,
I mean,
totally fine.
We'll talk about only Idaho.
Thank God.
We'll talk about Idaho. That's a good point.
Yeah.
So we'll talk about Idaho. Like, you don't have to stay on the land here if you don't want to. You can sell it. Now, the thing is like, as a community, how do we provide someone like a farmer whose 401k is that 1,000 acres we've been talking about? How do we provide for them? How do we provide for them to make sure they are getting what they need from it, versus someone who was working, in an office and contributing for years in their 401k, and that, they get to keep that at the end. It doesn't necessarily take from that.
There's a parallel that I think is really important for people to understand, at least from what I can see. And again, I'm an idiot, so like maybe this analogy is terrible, but if you look at a farm as a revenue producing investment, it's a revenue producing mechanism, right? And it goes up in value and makes money at the same time. And then we collectively were like, well, we actually really need that farm, like collectively as people. So like, we're going to make sure that you can't do whatever you want with it. Okay. That sentiment very much parallels the draconian rent control that I saw play out in Berkeley and Oakland and San Francisco and Santa Monica and all these other places in California, because what they were saying is, hey, property owner, you own this property. You own this apartment building. This is a revenue producing asset. It produces money and it goes up in value, and it's really fundamental. We need this housing. And so what we don't want is for you to do individually whatever you should have the right to do with your property. So we're going to put rent control. We're going to restrict how you can, whether you can condominiumize it, whether you can break it up into small, again, you have like a five apartment complex. We're going to stop you from breaking those up into individual condominiums and selling them to people. No, you can't do it because we need it. It's the exact same, at least in my mind, it seems very, very similar to what I hear people talking about with farmland. It's like, we can't do that. Like, they have rights. They purchased this thing. It may have been in their family for multiple generations, going up in value, and they're working it. We can't take that away from them. If we do anything, we need to properly incentivize them so they voluntarily engage in it and happily engage in it, because that's what they feel is right for them for whatever reason. But we need to do our part with incentivization. The idea that like we need this collectively as a community, and therefore we're going to essentially take a small part of your rights for our benefit, is so objectionable to me. It's so wrong. And it's something that we see play out in other areas. And like, we can't do that to our farmers here.
No. And do we really need to? Like, and that's what I ask myself when I'm listening to you talking. I think we're talking about the carrot and stick. To me, can we create a carrot that keeps the land, that creates enough value for the person, the farmer, the producer, that says, I'm willing to do a conservation easement. I'm going to take this initial payment. And then hopefully they invest in their business. They invest in some sort of equipment, they fix things, they do something to increase the value of their business. Sure. Sometimes it's buying out a sibling. Like let's say there's 4 siblings and a conservation easement or agriculture easement, the payment for that will consolidate ownership. They can actually buy out somebody who wants out. And then they consolidate ownership, and then they can keep going. Right. Sometimes there are producers that will continue to grow their operation, and so they've taken on a debt load. So they do an agricultural easement, they stitch it all together, they get a payment for that, and then they pay off their loan, and then now they can continue to grow their business with either no debt or lower debt.
Right. And again, there are all kinds of reasons people will go after it. One thing that I keep thinking about that I'm probably not articulating, this guy, AJ Osborne, who does, I think it's like Cedar Creek Investments or Capital or something like that. But he makes luxury RV and boat storage. Okay. And makes very beautiful. I've seen pictures and renderings and this whole thing. He wanted to do one. And I think he's moving forward with it at the corner of Beacon and 55 and just around the corner. And there was this huge uproar from people predominantly in my community because he came to try to do, like a meet and greet and questions and everything. And everybody was upset about it. And I ended up doing a podcast with him. Like, will you just explain to me what's happening? Right. And people, no matter what, even though he explained this whole thing, people, no matter what, saying, well, look, I'm just categorically going to fight against development. And in talking to them, he said, look, in doing that, you are literally forcing labor onto someone, because the idea is, okay, somebody owns this land over here and this is their best use. They have been farming it, their cattle, everybody likes seeing the cattle, fine, whatever. And then AJ comes along, he's like, hey, I would like to buy a portion of this or all of it, whatever it might be, to build this boat storage, RV and boat storage, which is desperately needed in this area. We don't have one anyway. Yeah. So the point is, he was like, if you stop people from doing that, what do you think happens to that land? First off, that landowner continues to have to pay property tax, right? Like that's a thing. And they have to work that land in some way to generate the money to pay property tax. He's like, you can't, I get that we like these things, but if there was an alternative for this person that was enticing, an alternative to the boat storage that was enticing for them, they're like, hey, actually I could do the boat storage, or there's this thing over here where I could get paid and not do the boat storage. That's great. But currently right now for that person, there wasn't that incentive structure. So the idea in my mind should not be that we need to stop people from being able to do this because we either like having access to what we think is beautiful land just right next to our house, or we like access to, cattle or whatever. They have a deal with the farm. The idea should not be stop them from developing, but should be, let's all work together to figure out an incentive that makes sense for them. That's the really important piece. And it could be, they could be using that incentive for whatever they want, buying out relatives, you were pointing out, or consolidating things, whatever, use it however you want. It doesn't matter. But the general populace should not be coming at it, in my mind. And again, I'm ignorant of how things really work in cities, but it shouldn't be, we don't want this, so let's remove the ability. It should be, okay, how can we fairly incentivize? And through incentivization, in good faith, then people, act in a manner that benefits everyone, right? But there should be no place where we're like, well, hey, I think you're going to act in a way that I don't like, so I should take away your ability to act that way. That to me seems wholly wrong. Mm-hmm. That's what I'm getting at.
Sure.
Yeah.
I mean, something else that tends to come up, is county comprehensive planning. And that tends to be at the intersection, at least right now in Idaho, tends to be at the intersection of development and agriculture, and almost really puts the two at odds with one another. And I think in some ways they could be looked at that way. And like kind of what you're saying, like, well, it's either we want the farm or we want the boat storage. It's like either or. There's no middle ground. There's no other conversation. And I think maybe what you're talking about is, how do we as a community come together and say, well, how do we make it where that farmer gets to make that decision? But really, like what you're talking about, that's already been developed, really, like Beacon and 55.
Yeah, of course.
I mean, that it's not like that was going to save the farm.
No, definitely not. And it's my understanding the land west of 55 from where we are right now is already sold.
Probably.
Right?
It's probably all option. Yeah. I mean, Beacon is developed all the way from here to 16, really.
Right.
I mean, if not, I think it's all completely developed now, but from 55 to 16, between the two state highways, it's...
Like, I have a friend who has 14 acres off of Beacon. It's like, great, awesome. But like, that's not, he had, cattle or horses and,
sure,
dogs and stuff, but he's not in agriculture really.
Right. I mean, and I think we have to get into a conversation of like, what does good development look like? Because people they're going to come here. Like, who wouldn't want to come here? It's wonderful. I love it here. You love it here. Nice here. It is. but we don't want anybody else to know that. So maybe don't put that in the podcast. But you know,
I
the
took a
secret's
picture of
out,
the
right?
sunrise. I took a picture of the sunrise this morning after dropping my kids off at school. It's like, why do people want to move to Idaho? And then it's like, Idaho.
Yeah, here we are, right?
I don't know what to tell you, man. It's awesome here.
Yeah, it's beautiful, right? Like
Yeah.
who wouldn't want to live here? And I love it here. I wasn't born here, but I likely will die here. I mean, I love it here. I want to stay here. I'm committed to being a part of the solution that we're talking about, or kind of talking around, or trying to be a part of that. Like I want to be a part of that solution. I love local food. And, you know, I've heard it recently, people talking about how, you know, like big ag is the problem, or, you know, development is the problem. Like we're looking at, we need big ag, we need small ag, we
Right.
need gardens, we need middle producers, we need the artisan tallow sticks, we need all of that. We need all of that to really create a robust food system. And that's where I come at it from. Like that's really my sort of passion point around all of this is food that's grown as locally as it can be. Now, I mean, I obviously go to Albertsons and I engage in buying things that are probably from anywhere else but Idaho, which is fine. Like that is,
We don't have a very robust pineapple
No.
grower off here. So like, I really like pineapples, man. I don't know what to tell you.
right. I mean, and that's the reality of being in the 21st century where we live, right? Like that's an option. We also, I do love going to the farmer's market. I love going and talking to the people that grew the food. I love the thought of someone wanting to move to this area to grow artisan stuff.
Yeah.
And I maybe I need to let me know when he makes it here and starts this, because I need to have this kidney fat on the beef. Like I really need to try this.
It's his whole thing is like there were two things in particular that he has a good way of looking. He can kind of look around corners in this very interesting way. He had this idea about 10 years ago to do this thing that he called a stoctagon. And I was like, Max, what are you talking about? He's like, listen, here's the deal. People are making their own stock. Right. There people are really getting into this. And he showed me this like Google Analytics and just like Google Trends and, you know, like stock recipes and stuff were skyrocketing. He's like, but the problem is we don't like people generally make a big pot of stock and then they freeze it, but they don't freeze it in discrete amounts, right? They freeze it in like a Ziploc bag or they freeze it in big containers. He's like, so what I want to do is make these silicone octagons of varying volumes, right? He's like 1 cup, half cup, whatever. And people can freeze that and then put those in bags. So if a recipe calls for 2 cups of stock, you go into the freezer, you get 2 of the cubes and you drop it in. So he had this idea. And then 6 months, he was making prototypes in his garage. And then 6 months later, somebody came onto Shark Tank with, instead of an octagon, it was a square shape, but exact same thing, silicone. So he had that idea. Now he's into the tallow. He's like, I'm telling you, bro, tallow. And his whole point is like, it's workflow. It's not the problem with ghee and tallow is not that they're inferior cooking additives. The problem is the workflow that the American populace is engaged in. And if I can substitute this into the workflow seamlessly, it'll be fantastic. It'll be inline, just boom. And he's very excited about it. I think he should do it and come here. Apparently,
and come here, right? Because
yeah.
we have all these, like you mentioned earlier, we have all these
The
great
kidney fat,
agricultural
he could get
processing
kidney fat.
facilities. I mean, we have that in our economy already. And, you know, the only way to keep those businesses going and those people employed is to keep the farmland.
Yes. Yes. God bless you, sir. Listen, we've talked about a lot of things. This has been a wild podcast. We've got a lot of interruptions. Hopefully the people watching had no idea. But is there anything you'd like to chat about at the end? I mean, again, I know we've talked about a bunch of things.
Sure. So, you know, I think coming out west, there is a history of mineral development. So I did want to talk about minerals that have come up.
Yes.
So, you know, many people that own a large piece of property, you ask them, do you own your mineral rights? And they'll say unequivocally, yes, I own my mineral rights. Well, the conversation around mineral rights is a little more complex than you might think. So mineral rights are generally looked at as what's below the surface. You know, your subsurface mineral rights or your mineral estate. There's all kind of ways to talk about what's below your property. And so here in the Treasure Valley, about 10 years ago, there was quite a bit of speculation around and exploration around oil and natural gas. So a lot of property, like in the Eagle Foothills and over into Emmett, there was a lot of exploration. Ultimately, Payette was where the natural gas is. There's some natural gas wells over there, but ultimately that's where it is. There's been other parts of the state too that have had other explorations around oil and gas, but generally, we have some cobalt here and there. We have the phosphate patch is a pretty big mining area, but in general, there's been plenty of speculation, but not necessarily a ton of mineral development everywhere. I mean, there's definitely mines that are getting a lot of attention and people pay attention to, but in general, that's not like a huge thing for Idaho necessarily. So anyway, where that kind of dovetails into when you start working on agricultural easements is that is one thing that if you're working with federal agency funding, they want to know about your mineral estate. Like, do you own it? Because what they, much to the point of making sure that, when you put a deed on your property and making sure it stays in conservation, one of the uses that would not be allowed would be mining. So they have to make sure that there's, so remote as to be negligible is the term that's used, making sure that a geologist takes a look at your property and says, ultimately they look at maps, they look historical, they look at the geology. I'm not a geologist. I don't really know exactly what they do, but ultimately they're the ones that are educated. They know what they're looking for. Right. They have a licensure that says that, hey, I've been to school. I can do this.
Right.
I just look for that and say, okay, here's your stamp and here's where you say so remote as to be negligible.
Geo 80 was a class at Cal, and everybody literally call it rocks for jocks. So all of the athletes, or a bunch of them, signed up for Geo 80. I went to one class. I'm like, there is no way I'm sitting through this. So I'll be honest, I didn't even take the class. I don't know what they do, but Geo 80 was like the class that people took.
And if you ever hang out with geologists, like especially driving around the West, my favorite thing to do is you're with a geologist and they're driving around. They're like, look at that right there. That's a geologic anomaly that shouldn't be there. And then they start talking about why it's not supposed to be there. And of course, my eyes gloss over.
Are you driving around? I mean, you're like, I'm on a bus with the geologist group and we're just driving to Seattle.
No, I mean, I have a few friends that are geologists, right? And so I didn't, I'm not, I have a biology degree. Like that's my, my background, my education. So I know science, but I don't know geology like that, right? Like I never did geology. I definitely stayed in like the human side of things and like trees and stuff.
Once they start going, they're like, well, what you find out is you have different, it's like you black out.
Oh yeah. They just gloss over. I have no idea what they're saying. I see their mouth is moving, but I don't really know what they're saying. Like I think they're using English, but it's not
like
I don't speak that
the
language.
Peanut cartoon.
Yes. Right. So then, I hear in this work that I have to do, I have to talk with geologists, and I'm just thinking, oh gosh, I hope I don't have to be the expert here, but what am I looking for, and what do I got to do? So, back to geology, right? So then this geologist looks and says, hey, on your title, I will help look on the title and say like, well, we can't really tell, or, an attorney will, or somebody, people look at the title and say like, it's very clear you do not own your mineral estate. Like somebody else owns it somehow. And so then a geologist will come in and basically say like, what, likely no mine would ever need to be developed here. And so that's sufficient for a federal agency to say, we'll put money towards this.
Gotcha.
The other side of that is, part of the IRS tax law is you can't take a deduction for, let's say, a conservation easement, or in this case, an agricultural easement, and then continue to do mining. Even gravel, like sand and gravel tends to be a pretty popular one. You can't do that. You can't say like, oh, I'm going to put this under easement, but I'm also going to save, I'm going to save my sand and gravel operation.
Right. That's 44 and 55 where they intersect. Right. Like if you make a right at the Home Depot and you go up to that hill road, that's a giant gravel pit, right? Like it was all a giant gravel pit, and they actually had to buy that gravel pit from the gravel guy to build that straight shot going north, because I guess the connection used to be you'd take Hill Road and then you'd go by the cemetery and then you'd connect in where Floating Feather hits 55, but like that north stretch wasn't originally there.
Right.
So so when you're talking about gravel, like we have a building industry here and we have gravel pits locally, like, so you essentially just have to take that into consideration as well.
Right. So, let's say you have a farm and you're in the river valley, and part of your operation is a sand and gravel operation, or you want to do that.
Sure.
You can. You just have to cut that out of the easement. You survey it out. You can still do that. You can have your easement beside it, but you cannot you cannot extract from an easement.
Right.
Because really it's conservation values, right? Like that's that's the contract or the agreement you're entering into. That's what you're being compensated for.
Right.
So to say like, I'm going to do a conservation easement and I'm going to enter in this agreement and then say, oh, I'm going to have this mine over here too. Like talk about a bad actor. That's what I was talking about. Things like that. Like those, there are safeguards in place and systems in place that do their best to prevent that. Now, I mean, there's definitely people, you know, we all know somebody who's going to push the limit.
Yeah.
And of course that
People
could happen.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. I mean, you know, we know our human brothers and sisters. We know how this goes. So, you know, ultimately, if you have a conservation easement and you work, or an agricultural easement and you work with an RCS, they tell you like, we need to know your mineral estate. If you can't prove that you own completely, then we'll get a geologist to assess that, you know, that mineral development is so remote as to be negligible. They're clear. And then when you go to work with the IRS, in order to give you your tax deduction, either if you do own your mineral estate in the deed, it would say you're not going to develop minerals.
Sure.
Or you have this report that says
we're not going to,
we don't own it, but nobody else is going to do it anyway. It's not even worth it.
Right.
You know, if it's not developed now, it probably won't be.
Gotcha.
But, you know, a lot of the older deeds, depending on where you are, you know, even the federal government maintained some access. So then to be able to lease it out and like other people have owned mineral estate, or like, for example, somebody sold off 100 acres to the neighbor, but they kept the minerals.
Right.
So like they sort of kept this, maybe someday this is going to be something. So then maybe you own your land and there's no mine on it, and there's no obvious activity, you may not own your mineral estate, even though like, and that's what I was saying. It's sometimes a little more complicated, because oftentimes when you do title work, these kind of transactions, there's a lot of deep title work, a lot of attorney review, multiple people review title and look at every single instrument on a title. And for land that's changed hands a number of times or has been used in a certain way, I mean, the title report has a number of exceptions, like 20 something exceptions that you have to go through and read all of them.
Right.
For a home, most of the time you don't, because like, what are you really going to do?
Right.
But for land, it's a whole different story.
I had a friend years back. It's like every time somebody buys a house, everyone tells you it's like title insurance is a scam, and he was like, "Dude, I don't even want to get this." But he was like, $1,500, fine, whatever. So he gets title insurance, and no joke, a year and a half after he moves in, he gets a knock on the door. It was the FBI, and they're like, "We need to talk to you." And so like, it was this whole big thing about how like the title hadn't been transferred appropriately and somebody had gone bankrupt and then like sold it out from under, like all these different things. And had he not gotten the title insurance, he would have lost his house. It would have been over. And because the FBI was not messing around, but he was like, "Oh wait, here, I have this thing." They're like, "Okay, we'll call it." And the insurance had to like pay through the nose or something. It was wild. Like it was bad news. So get your title insurance, people.
Yeah.
Anyway, listen to me. I appreciate you, sir. Thank you for coming in today. Thank you for explaining all this stuff. Again, I think it is really important for people like me who have not engaged in this to just understand. It's like, listen, we all need to work together. We need to figure out incentive structures. We need to preserve our ag land for a multitude of reasons, not the least of which I love seeing Highland cows and like longhorns and stuff. They're pretty awesome.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, it's good times. Thank you for coming in.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Hopefully we can do it again.
Yeah, sounds great.